So over the last several years, there's been a genre of movies and books I've actually come to like, and I didn't like them before, but it's biographical movies. Anybody like those or anybody not like those? Okay, how about you like them? Raise your hand. You don't like them, raise your hand. Okay, a couple of you are in that category too. That's okay. The reason why I end up liking them, though, is because I'm always amazed at how they can take someone's whole life, and especially the writer or the director can pull out these major moments of their life and give it one cohesive narrative and one cohesive theme from beginning to end. Whether it's in a book, whether it's in a movie, you see how this person, like for example, there's a movie called A Beautiful Mind, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you watch it on TV. But nevertheless, the person walking through it, you see kind of how he comes from kind of a proud man to working through, and then at the very end, you see that he gets this Nobel Prize, and you see how all this works together, and you see the themes sweeping through of his life, and you're seeing it put together in such an amazing way to see that this brilliant scientist who has some major problems in the middle can end up having the Nobel Prize, and you see that's amazing how all this kind of fit together. But is that the way that life really works? That's a question, right? Because, if you're honest with yourselves, I think most of us would see that's great. But if you were going to put together your own life story today, don't just think about who would play you, but think about what would be the major thing that actually comes out? What would be the major purpose behind it? And I think if we're honest, I think a lot of us might say to ourselves, I'm not sure that my life would make a very good movie. I think for some of us, we think that our lives are too purposeless or meaningless to have anything exciting happen. For the most part, we just kind of wake up, we go to work, we come back, or we wake up, we watch kids, and we that's really our lives. And it doesn't feel like often there's a really good purpose or point that some kind of great writer or some kind of great director is putting things together in a way that actually gives it some kind of purpose and meaning. I think for other people, it's hard to believe that there's some great purpose in our stories, because you look at the world and it seems a little too chaotic. It seems too crazy. We've seen this year that there's been countries invading other countries this year. And it's happened before this year, but we've seen that happen. Not only that, but sometimes not only have we seen that kind of war, but there's so many difficult things. Our society becomes more and more divisive. It's become more and more morally corrupt. And it's hard to see that there's actually a purpose. Just last week, we saw a tornado sweep through. That seems like that's chaotic. It seems like it actually took out several houses, even a warehouse in Brownsburg, unfortunately. And the world often seems too chaotic or too random to have some kind of cohesive story behind it. And because the world is so dark, it's hard to believe that it's leading anywhere redemptive. It's hard to believe that there's some kind of cohesive, sweeping narrative that actually leads to something good and something glorious. But friends, despite how things look and how we might think, there is an almighty writer and director that is shaping everything together. Everything's crafted by design. This writer is weaving together everything. He's even weaving together even the most mundane parts of your life to his great and glorious purpose. He is crafting a story that includes both blessings and curses so that he can bring about the redemption of the world and the justice against evil and sin. And this director is lining up even the most minute details of seemingly insignificant lives to put them together in a grand narrative and of great importance for the entire world and our individual lives. And friends, if that's true, I think that should cause us to be excited, because every moment that happens to you has a purpose. Every moment, even the most mundane things, every action matters, not just to your story, but for the story of the whole world that God is writing. But the beauty of that is this, that the whole world's also not on your shoulders. Someone else is working out the grand plan through all things. There's a great Redeemer shaping a great story of redemption in your life and through all of time. That is what we find in the book of Ruth today. We see ordinary people and seemingly mundane details coming together to write a grand narrative of redemption, not just in their lives, but in the entire world. This is really what we see in this book. We see God's hand shaping all the events of mankind, both the minor ones and the major ones. And on its surface, it's a very, very human book. You really relate with Naomi when she goes through hardship. You really relate with Ruth when she sacrifices everything to be with her in her loyalty. You really relate with her as she sacrifices everything to be with her mother-in-law. And you can even relate with Boaz and his kindness. Or you can even relate with a nearer kinsman redeemer later on who has a hesitancy to lose out for himself. Yet this book is also not just about human interaction. It's about divine setting up of all things. It's about the divine providence of God. So why in the world should this small story about two widows scratching to survive in this agrarian society during one of the most rebellious times in all of the Bible, the time of the Judges, why should that kind of story matter? Well, because there's a master writer, and in this book we also see that this is a part of his grand design to redeem the world. It is a very human book, but it's how God is crafting it together. He's working out all the details of the entire world perfectly for his glory and for the good of those who fear him. So today I want to introduce the book. I'm going to go give us an overview of it and the major theme that comes across, which is the providence of God. And the providence of God is that he is working out the details of life for his glory and the good of those who fear him. And so today, as we see that sweeping narrative, I'm going to break a rule here of what you're not supposed to do when you read a book. I'm going to read the first paragraph and a little bit more and the last paragraph. You're really not supposed to do that. But I'm hoping that gives you a sweeping narrative of this and a sweeping idea of God's providence from beginning to end. So in chapter 1, if you could turn with me to the book of Ruth, I would encourage you to turn along in your own Bible if you want to follow along. It's near the beginning of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. It's right before Judges. It's right after Judges, right before 1 Samuel. And you don't have to know everything about the Bible to be a part of our church, but we do encourage you to follow along in your own copy of God's Word. This is during the time of the Judges, it'll say, and so we'll explain a little bit of that, but we'll probably explain more of that next week. Let's read from verses 1 through 6. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food." Now I want to stop right there. There's so much more to the story, but that's the hardship part of it. I want you to also see God's hand at the end. So slip all the way to the end. I'm ruining the story. You can go back and read it. I'm ruining it, but that's okay. I want you to read chapter 4, verses 13. I want to read through to verse 22 so we can see at the end what the writer's pointing us towards and how we're going to get there. So verse 13 says, "So Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more than 7 sons, has given birth to you.' Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, 'A son has been born to Naomi.' They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Now, I know those last parts might not make sense to you, but I hope today you'll see how God is shaping the story of the grand narrative, not only of these two people, but of his story of redemption. And so in this passage of Scripture, I want you to see through the book of Ruth, what we're going to see highlighted time and time again is God's providence at work. So how? That's what I want to ask ourselves this morning, and we'll use the book of Ruth and see the sweeping narrative of Ruth to kind of answer this question. How is God working out his providence in the world? How is God working out his plan in the universe? And so what we see in the book of this little book is how God is working. And so the first thing I want you to see this morning is that God is supreme in his providence. That means God is in control over everything that happens in the world. Did you hear that? He is in control over everything that happens in this world. And I want you to know that that's what the book of Ruth is trying to tell us. And it tells us in several ways. But this book has God's handprints written all over it. The author, whoever he or she might be, we're not sure who this is, but they let us know from the beginning, and there's two statements about God's direct activity that the narrator tells us. There's really only two places the narrator says God is working. But the way that they line it up from the beginning and end, you're meant to see that God is at work in all of this. It is his hand. The first place we see God's hand is in verse 6 of chapter 1. She arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. That's the one place we see God's hand. He had stopped a famine, had given them food. The other place you see God's hand is at the very, very end, chapter 4, verse 13. We also read it. So Boaz took Ruth. She became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore her a son. Now, the rest of the book doesn't really mention much of God. So why is that? Why is it at the beginning and the end? Here's what the narrator is trying to say. God is in all this book. From beginning to end. This is what we would call an inclusio. Okay? It happens at the beginning, it happens at the end, and everything else in between, you're supposed to be thinking, this is God working here. This is God's work in every little detail in this book. And it's meant to show us that everything that happens is a work of God. It reminds us that God is supreme. He is the supreme actor in the book. And he is what we would call sovereign, or the king over the universe, ruling over everything, causing all the events to move according to his perfect will. We read this morning in Psalm 115:3. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. That's the truth. God is in control of all of this. Now, we don't often recognize that when we're complaining, right? We're complaining about the world and how things are going. We don't often recognize that it's actually we're complaining against God. I remember being a youth pastor 8 years ago, and we were running this youth rally, and I had planned out the course of events. We were doing it with several other churches and things like that. And so one of our youth leaders came up, unbeknownst to him. He didn't know I had planned the events, but he started complaining about how everything was lined up and how why we did something at the beginning and why something was done at the end and why something was in the middle. And he had no idea who he was complaining. The person he was complaining to was the one who organized everything. And so I had to sit there and I explained, well, here's the reason why we had these activities at the beginning that were a little less organized, because we wanted people to be able to come in and just join in. And then we had a little more organized things in the middle so that we could get everybody together. And then at the very end, after everybody's together, we had somebody speak. And then we had food at the end. So I was trying to explain to him all the reasons why. And suddenly in the middle of that explanation, he realized that the person he complained to was the person who set things up. And all of a sudden things changed in his mind. And he was like, oh yeah, it's fine. It's great. I didn't want to complain to you. But I really think that oftentimes we don't think about the fact that our world, our lives, are set up by somebody else that is working all these details out. In fact, it's hard for us to believe that, especially when things are difficult in our lives. We often find ourselves not just complaining about what other people do, but how our lives are arranged. And I wonder if we recognize we're complaining about God, who is arranging all things in our lives. See, we have a tendency to either fail to give him credit for what we see is good and we take the credit, or we fail to recognize how his plan is perfectly being worked out, even in ways that we can't see, and we fail to see why he's doing it. And we also complain. We complain either we complain about our lives, not thinking about the fact that we're complaining about God, or perhaps we complain because we know God's in control and we think we know better. But friends, in the midst of that, sometimes we might even have a hard time believing he is in charge of all things, but he is. And that's illustrated in this book in a lot of different ways. God's in control of, not just in this book, but in the Bible, throughout the Bible, we see God's supreme control in all things. And there's a couple examples that you see of how this has worked out. First of all, God's in control of the small and the big things in this book. In the very beginning, we see from beginning to end in the book of Ruth, God is in control of even the small, seemingly unimportant matters, but he's also in control of the big picture. See, Ruth in this, we'll get there, but I'm just going to tell you a few examples. Ruth could have gleaned in anyone's field, but she came to Boaz's field. And while she's in Boaz's field, Boaz happened to come to the reapers that day. He doesn't always come to the reapers that day where she is. These are not accidental occurrences, but they are God orchestrating all the seemingly unimportant details of their lives together for his purpose. In fact, this is what Jesus says about these kind of minor things. He says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father." In other words, those birds that you feed at your house, some of you do, those birds aren't going there accidentally to feed seeds. They are not falling to the ground or dying except for the Father doing this in his will. See, the reality is even the most minor creatures, all of that is being set up by God's perfect hand of providence. God not only orders, though, the smallest activities, but he ordains the activities of every even little creature. But equally, God is in control of the big picture. And at the very end of this book, we see a zoomed out picture of what it was all about. So you see, as you zoom out further, this isn't just a story about 2 women surviving. It's the survival of God's chosen bloodline of his king. So in chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, we see that this is connected to God's grand plan to give Israel their chosen king, King David. It's a part of also his grand plan of redemption, because Ruth, Boaz, and Obed are not just in the line of King David, but in the line of Jesus Christ. So while God is providentially ordering everything, even the smallest events of feeding widows in need, he's also ordering all these small events to work together for his ultimate plan for the entire world. So God is sovereign over the big thing, or the small things, and the big things, and the big picture. And I think that probably one of these is harder for you to believe than the other. I don't know which one, but perhaps some people have a harder time believing that God could put all things together in some kind of good purpose and glorious purpose, because you look at all the world and all the conflicting things going on and activities going on in the world, it's hard to see that something's in control. In fact, sometimes things look like they're out of control. But if we could zoom out and see God's glorious purpose from the way that he sees it, so to speak, we'd see how intricate and glorious his plan really is. Now, I think most of us in here might agree, yeah, God has a big purpose. I think the thing that we struggle with even more so, though, is that we find it hard to believe that God is working out in the minor things, in the small things, in your everyday mundane lives. And I'm not saying you're mundane. I'm just saying that our everyday life, God is also crafting together those details. When things don't work out as we planned, what do? We get angry. Well, why is that? Things weren't supposed to work out that way. You know what we're saying? I'm God, and I want things to work out the way I want them to work out today. But friends, what you have to understand is everything that happened to you today, even the minor things that happen to you today, are on purpose. They happen because God is sweeping this grand design together. So God is not just the Lord of the big and complex. He's the Lord of every detail, every affair of mankind. But this book also shows us another aspect of how God is in control over all things, even things that don't seem to go together. He's in control of the things that are good and bad. This book shows us how God is sovereign over blessings and curses. That's seen at the very, very beginning when we see Well, we already saw the blessings God gave in chapter 1, verse 6. God gave them food. And then chapter 4, verse 13, God allowed them to have conception and bore a son. Both of those things are the blessings that God gives. But this book is also reminding us equally that God's hand is in the hardships as well. Who brings the famine at the beginning? Is that just a random thing? No, that is God. In fact, it's actually probably tied to the fact that during the time of Judges, they were consistently away from God. And one of the promises he gave to his people in their covenant was that if they ran from him, if they disobeyed him, if they did not live up to their covenant, that one of the things that would happen would be a famine. God's in control of the famine. What happens to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon is not an accident. That's the hand of God. In fact, if you look at what Naomi says at the end of chapter 1, she might not have everything right about what's going on, but her theology about God is spot on in that all those things happened to her from the hand of God. That's true. God is sovereign over the good things that happen in our life and the bad things. And he's even sovereign when sinful people act and evil choices of men are made. Now, the Lord is not the direct cause of evil in the world. He does not sin or tempt anyone to sin, but that does not mean that he is still not sovereignly working out his purpose through the sinful choices of mankind. You know how I know that's true? Because God absolutely is behind the worst evil that ever happened on the earth, the killing of the Son of God. He was absolutely behind that. Everything good or bad is a part of God's supreme providence. God is sovereign in the good and the bad times. So first of all, that means that whatever good happens to you comes from God. And we like to take credit when things are good. But everything you have that is good comes from God. Your family, your job, your blessing, whatever blessing you've been given is from God. But second, it's not just the good things that God's in control of. It's not as if somebody else is in control of the difficulty and hardships or even the evil, while God is only sovereign over the good things. God is sovereign over everything. And at first, that might not be a comforting thought. In fact, that's one of the great accusations against Christianity. If God is so holy, if he's so just, why is there calamity? Why is there evil in the world? How could God allow such terrible things like tornadoes and World War II into the world? Now, I'm going to give you a better answer at the end. But for now, understand that it cannot be because such a God does not exist. Or else, how would you know what good and bad are even? If there's not a lawgiver, you wouldn't know the law. You wouldn't know the difference in good and evil here. And you can't borrow words from Christianity and concepts from Christianity and say you can still be a moral person without God. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because you wouldn't have those concepts without a lawgiver. But you also have to understand that the alternative is far more scary. If you have this belief that, well, sometimes evil gets their punches in, sometimes good gets their punches in, but you know, it's kind of this warring dualism, so to speak, that's a frightening perspective to say. The Bible gives us far more hope that there is a God in control of all things. The Bible gives us hope that nothing is outside of God's control or how he's ordered the universe. If something happens and God says, man, I didn't know Satan was going to do that, that's a problem. But God is not out of control. How these calamitous activities and acts of evil people are worked out by the Holy Spirit, I'm going to save that for the end. But for right now, understand that God is in control. So the next few points I want to go through quickly, but I think they're important. God is also, how also is God working out his providence in the world? God is often quiet in his providence. And I told you from beginning to end here that God's hand, you see his hand from the very first part and the very last part. But what's interesting about God's hand of providence in the book of Ruth is that apart from those two instances that I already mentioned, God's hand doesn't really directly appear by the author. Now, certainly some of the characters are recognizing God's hand in the works that are going on, but this book contains no other places where God does anything directly. Everything's being worked out seemingly in normal circumstances. It means God's quietly working behind the scene. This book contains no miracles like the parting of the Red Sea. It contains no seemingly improbable activities like someone being swallowed by a giant fish. All that happens are ordinary, everyday events. And the author is telling us that the God behind these events is working out his will quietly with ordinary everyday activities. You know, I had a friend not too long ago tell me he would only believe in God if God made himself evident. And what he meant by that is that if God actually showed him a miraculous, undeniable way that he exists, he would believe. Now, I don't think he's alone in what he thinks. But friends, if that's your mindset, the reality is you're going to miss God. Because the primary way that God works is not in miraculous ways. That might seem hard to believe because you read the Bible, you see all these different miracles. Actually, if you chalk up and look at all those instances where these things happened, it's actually a minuscule amount of time that God actually works these miracles compared to the rest of the world where he's really not showing himself in that way. And I really believe the miracles are true, but really that's not the normal way that God shows himself. And that still does not mean he is not working, even if we don't perceive his hand is at work. And we're tempted to think that God's only working, or at least most at work, in miraculous and the big moments and not in the mundane, everyday parts of your life. But God is most often working in quiet, seemingly imperceptible ordering of events. God's alive and working even if you never experience an outright miraculous event in your life. And if that's what you're seeking for, to believe in God, you won't get it for two reasons. Number one, God is not your monkey. God's not your pet monkey that will do whatever you want. And if you say, I'll only believe in you if you do what I say, you know what that means? You're making yourself God. God's not going to answer that kind of request. That's the first reason why you're probably, most likely, not going to receive a miracle that points to God. Second reason is this. Even if you saw one, you probably wouldn't perceive it as a miracle. You know, there are a lot of people that saw Jesus' miracles. They didn't believe in him. So what makes you think that even if you saw a miracle, that in your hard-hearted state, you would actually believe it? You wouldn't. So the reality is, that's really a moot point. God is not just working in the miraculous ways. He's working in your life, here and now, in normal, ordinary ways. But this also prevents us from believing or just looking for God in miracles and waiting for him to act in big, evidential ways. Some people expect a burning bush every time they need to make a decision. It doesn't happen. You know what God wants us to do? Make wise choices that will glorify God the best way we can. That's what he's asking you to do. He's not asking you to find his will in a burning bush or in the clouds. Maybe God's going to talk to you in the clouds today. It's not going to happen. He primarily wants us to trust him in our lives and consider the best way we can glorify him with what we're given. But this also lets us know that every moment, however mundane, is worked out by God, and it's an opportunity to trust him. Friends, there are no throwaway moments in your life. There are no throwaway days in your life. God is working in each and every one of them. They all matter. They're all a part of God's intricate plan and purpose. We live knowing God is ever present in our lives in everything. What you ate this morning, where you're going to lunch today. I just gave 2 food examples, but still, God is in work in them. Whatever you do, God is at work. Third thing I want you to see, though, because you might be saying to yourself, well, if God's at work, what is there a point in doing? God uses human activity in his providence. God uses human activity. Just because God is at work in everything he does not mean that human activity means nothing. God works so that what we do actually matters. And God is sovereignly working in all these events in the book of Ruth, but he primarily does this through the characters in the book. The narrator actually reports the events almost exclusively coming from human actions. And the implication is this, that God is acting, but he's acting through his people. He's using human actions to bring about his will. So to highlight this, the author does something very interesting. Every single prayer that we see from the people is worked out in some kind of way. Look with me real quick to chapter 1, verse 9. This is what a prayer or a blessing given to Orpah and Ruth. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. So that's Naomi's prayer because of their kindness to her. She prays that the Lord that they would find rest, each of them in the house of their husband. Guess what happens at the end of the book? Ruth finds rest in the house of her husband. Let's look at another one real quick. This is Boaz In chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz says to Ruth, because of her kindness to Naomi, may the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Guess what happens at the end of the book? God repays Ruth far more than what she gave. Then, if you skip down a few verses, Naomi says of Boaz, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness was not forsaken the living or the dead. Boaz is blessed at the end. Look at the very end of the book, chapter 4, verse 12, 11 and 12. This is an interesting one. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Guess what happens a few verses later? This happens. They build up not only the house of Israel, but the house of King David. So why is the author reporting all of these blessings, all of these prayers that these people are giving? Because God is working through human activity. Now, he's sovereign over all things, and a lot of people would say to themselves, why should I pray? Why should I do anything if God's just sovereign over all things? Because God chooses to use human activity to work about his will. And you might say to yourself, I don't know how both of those work together, and I don't. But what I do know is that God is using our prayers to work about his will. And that's what it's saying in this passage. Nothing happens except from human activity that they are giving up to God, and God's the only one that can answer prayer. So it's God working out his will, but he's using human beings to do it. I know that's hard, but it's because God chooses to act through his people that allows us to say it matters what we do. And it's because God chooses to use his people to look like himself that it matters. And this is especially seen in the major characteristic that Ruth and Boaz show, the quality that God also shares with his people. There's a repeated word you'll see throughout the book of Ruth. In English, it's used probably loving kindness or kindness is used. The word is hesed. It doesn't necessarily, we don't have an exact word for it in English, but what it means is God's loyal love for his people. And oftentimes it's used in that way. God will we read it this morning in Psalm 115. His loving kindness, his hesed towards his people. He will keep that. But in this book, it's not God just simply giving his hesed. It's these people acting out that hesed, that loyal kind of love. So when Ruth will not forsake her mother-in-law, and continues with her. She practices hesed, and Boaz says, may you be blessed because of the loving kindness you showed, and because you've come under the care of the God of Israel. When Boaz shows loving kindness to them, he is showing that, and Naomi says, blessed be him for his loving kindness that he showed to us, and that's God. But you know what the author is really trying to tell us is that this characteristic of God is being lived out by his people. And when that happens, it's as if God is acting through his people. In fact, one commentator put it this way: whenever people of faith practice godlike hesed, or loving kindness, or loyal love toward each other, God himself acts in them. And in such a conduct, his will is done on earth as it is in heaven, as Jesus prayed in Matthew 6:10. So Paul puts it as for believers today, he says it like this: we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God ordained beforehand that we should walk in them. That's what you are. The reason why Christians are called Christians is because of this. Christians means little Christs. God's put us on this earth. He sent us out to live out his will on his behalf. And when we do that, we are living out God's will in the lives of other people. You know, the president has a lot of people that act on his behalf. There's a lot of things that other people do for him, but they do it in the name of the president. Probably the most notable or the most noble is probably the press secretary. The press secretary is charged with the task of speaking to the media when the president's not around and not available to make comments. And in that moment, the press secretary is essentially acting as the president, speaking his words, explaining what he's doing and what his plans are and what his purpose is with those plans. And though the president is there, though the president is not there, it's almost like he is there. And God's people are meant to serve in a similar way, although it's not just about answering questions from other people. We are meant to look and sound like God, and when we do His will, He acts through us. God uses the actions of ordinary people to fulfill His perfect will, and that reminds us that our actions do matter. God is fulfilling His will and His plan, not just in the end of things, but in the means to the end, even in our choices. And that also reminds us that particularly that God is working in this world through the faithfulness of His people, especially in dark times. Friends, you might be the means that God uses to bring about His eternal good work in the world. And the place God has put you right now is not an accident, but He calls you to show His glory and do what He's revealed, and do His revealed will where you are. Friends, believers have a part to play, and you have to play it. And perhaps God has sent you to such a person today. Or maybe God is sending you fellow believers, and you're not recognizing this as the hand of God in your life. Maybe you're not a Christian. Somebody's been sharing the gospel with you for a long time. And you know what? You're not recognizing the hand of God in your life. And my prayer is that you'll recognize that those people have been sharing the gospel with you over and over, and it's not them doing it, but it's God through them doing it to you. Friends, as fellow believers, I wonder if you recognize and are thankful for how God is working out His sovereign will with those people around you. Those people that you attend church with is not an accident. The fact that you're here is not an accident. And you were placed here within His local church to live out the same characteristics that God has with one another. And as we do that, God is lived out in our lives. The next thing, I want to go through this quickly, but God repays people in His providence. One of the major themes in the book of Ruth is repayment. I'm not going to go into great detail, but you see throughout the book, some people are repaid. If see, kind of possibly at the very, very beginning with what happens with the famine, God is laying out His judgment on His people, so He's repaying them in that way. But then later on, we're meant to see God's hand going about repayment in a different way, in a positive way. God repays Ruth and Boaz for their faithful love to God, and He outgives them from their sacrifice. So Boaz and Ruth show loving kindness to others in small ways, but God outgives them by honoring them with being in the royal line of King David and Jesus Christ Himself. All that reminds us about a few things with God. First, what God asks us to do is good. His law is good. What He wants us to do is for our blessing, not so that we receive some kind of curse. There's a repayment God wants to give. And this also tells us that God will not forget those who selflessly act for His glory. He will reward far more than they sacrifice. And that might even mean that their reward is reverberated throughout eternity. And that might mean that even the smallest deeds that we do, God will repay to the highest degree. So every act we have to consider as being done for God. But if that's true, on the one hand, that's encouraging. On the other hand, it's frightening. If we receive what we deserve, how will we ever escape judgment? That's where the last part of this book and what we're really pointing towards in Providence comes. God is redemptive in His providence. God is a God of reversals. And in this passage, God is working out His providence to redeem His people and to redeem the entire world. So from the smallest to the greatest things in this book, He is showing this to be His ultimate goal. So at the end of the day, the story of Ruth is about reversals and redemption. And so in the small ways, it's played out in the redemption of the characters in the story. Elimelech's family is redeemed by Boaz. Ruth with Obed. Naomi's curses at the beginning are reversed with the birth of Obed later on. Ruth, the Moabite, is outside of the people of God, and she is redeemed by faith to be a part of the people of God and find refuge in God and in Boaz. Thus, God, in this small story, He's righting all the wrongs. He's redeeming them from calamity, even the consequences of their sin from the beginning. God does that in individual lives, but if we zoom out to the end of the book, we're reminded these small instances of redemption are pointing to God's bigger plan of redemption. The big question mark and the big question the book is trying to answer is, how could God direct and redeem his people out of the darkest period, one of the darkest periods in their history, the time of the judges? How is God going to redeem his people in the midst of that? And so God in this story is showing that he is working things out to redeem his people. And in their case, he was going to give David out of the royal line. He was taking them out of chaos and into order, out of divisiveness and into unity. And God still reserved a few of his people who lived out his covenant love so that he would orchestrate things to redeem his people. But here's the beauty of being a New Testament believer. We can zoom out even more. Because the plan of redemption doesn't stop with David. As we zoom out even further, we see God's full plan of redemption and what this book is pointing towards. Ruth and Boaz and their son Obed are not only in the line of David, they're mentioned in the line of Christ in the book of Matthew chapter 1. And God perfectly lined up all these events to give us Jesus, the one chosen by God to redeem mankind from their sin if we choose to repent and believe in him. God rewards those who fear him through his perfect Son who died on the cross as a payment for our sin. Friends, that Redeemer that they're waiting for, that they're saying, hey, all these things are working out, they were all working out to give us Jesus in the end. And the Redeemer has come. And this book is a reminder that in the small and the large things, in the good and the bad things, in the everyday life things, in the miraculous ways, in the direct divine activity, and in the human activity, in every way, God is perfectly lining up his plan of redemption for the entire world. He's reversing the wrongs. He's making them right. He will use everything. And he will even use the evils of mankind to bring about his glorious redemptive purpose. Friends, how do I know that? Because Jesus Christ died at the hands of sinners so that you could be saved. Even the most evil instances are being reversed. And even right now, friends, you are people of redemption. You're living out that redemptive life. You're a part of that plan of redemption. Even now, there's no accidental moments. There's no mundane, boring acts that are overlooked. Even our own choices are what God is using to bring about his glorious plan of redemption. And we should rejoice in that and never take a moment for granted. And I shared this not too long ago, but I'm going to share it again. I was in an art appreciation class when I was in college. Didn't love it, but went and did it. And we had to go to an art museum at that time. And one of the art displays I went to literally was made of trash. And I remember thinking, that was lazy. Like, why did you make that? That just doesn't seem like art to me. But as I stepped back, the amazing thing was it really just literally looked like a bunch of trash put on the wall. But as you stepped back, all this trash was actually made into an image of a beautiful woman. And as you looked at that image, you actually saw, okay, they were putting all these little things together that seemed like they were pointless. And it actually was a very, very impressive display that I looked at. And the author was trying to tell us something about recycling, and that's not bad. I'm not saying not to recycle. But what I couldn't help but think of is all these little meaningless pieces of trash were put together for a glorious purpose. Glorious redeeming purpose. He was changing them and transforming them into something glorious. Friends, that's the biggest answer for why things are happening in the world. We might not know every detail of why, but as we look back, and when we look back in all of time, we'll see how God brought about the greatest possible good to redeem his people and to redeem the world. That's what he's doing. He's reversing the curse. And we might not know all the specifics and grand reasons why something happens in the world or why God would allow evil in the world, but what we have illustrated over and over is that what's intended for evil, God intends for the greatest possible good, as he showed 2,000 years ago when the Son of God was brutally killed at the hands of sinful men, and he rescued the whole world from sin, shame, and anguish. For my unbelieving friends, that means that God invites you to be redeemed, to be changed, to be transformed. For my believing friends here today, will you enter the story of redemption and live it out with Christ? Friends, that reminds us that his people are called the task of reversing the course of sin through Christ. That starts in your own life, but it continues on in how you live the gospel life with other people. You are called to his redemptive purposes. Friends, as we partake of the communion table today, we remember God's plan of redemption through Christ and his plan of redemption moving forward. See, the horror of the cross is really Jesus giving his body and blood so that we might have life. And as we take him into ourselves symbolically, we're symbolically showing that by faith we are living out his redemptive purposes in our lives today. In partaking together, we're rejoicing in the body and blood. We're recommitting ourselves to live redeemed lives and go out with the task of redeeming as God calls us to, in the small ways and in the big ways.